All right, are you a golfer dealing with hip pain? Then you're in luck. We're going to go over the main causes of hip pain during golf and the 3 types of hip discomfort that we see most golfers struggle with that keeps them off the golf course. Let's go. All right, welcome back to another episode of the Man of Golf Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Doc Russ. Today we're talking about all things hips. It's all in the hips. If you don't know that movie, it's Happy Gilmore, and you need to watch that movie ASAP.
Yeah, it's all in hips. It's all in.
All right, so we're going to break down the causes of your hip discomfort while you're playing golf, but also 3 specific types of hip pain that golfers struggle with that doesn't allow them to play the golf they want to play. First things first, hip mechanics become so important during the golf swing. And unfortunately, when we see golfers play, we see a lot of lateral motion, side-to-side motion instead of rotary motion, right? When we want to see on the backswing and the downswings, you want to see those hips turn and swivel versus going side to side, right? And if we see a lot of side-to-side motion, that can create a lot of excess stress on the outside aspects of your hip joints, which can cause more discomfort, okay? So we want to see less sway and slide and more rotation in golfers when they swing. Secondly is repetitive overuse, okay? Sometimes it's as simple as doing too much too soon. Let's say the weather gets nicer, you want to go on the driving range, you hit a bunch of balls, and again, if you're having a lot of that lateral motion and your mechanics are off, that's going to create a lot more excess stress, which potentially could contribute to the discomfort that you're experiencing in your hips. 2 is if you do a lot of walking on the golf course versus riding in a cart. Sometimes if you haven't been doing a lot during the off season and all of a sudden you ramp up your activity, again, if you're doing too much too soon, doing too much walking on the golf course with different terrain and slope, that sometimes can bug the hips and cause more hip discomfort as well. All right, so let's talk about 3 main types of hip pain that we see a lot of our golfers that we work with struggle with when they're playing on the golf course or trying to play through that discomfort. The first one is this idea of hip bursitis, right? So that's pain on the outside part of the hip, and we see that a lot on the downswing, right? If we get a lot of slide on the downswing, you get a lot of extra stress on the outside of the hip, and there's that bursa, which is basically a fluid-filled sac, which sometimes can get irritated and cause a lot of discomfort. A simple test you can do to see if potentially if you have it is just to stand on one leg. If you stand on one leg and experience that discomfort outside of the hip, then potentially that could give you an idea as to what's kind of going on in your hip. You also need to differentiate what that bursitis kind of issue is versus what we call a glute tendon issue, right? So your glutes are your big powerhouse of your lower body, and your glute muscles are also attached into the outside part of your hip. So a lot of times you get this big general vague diagnosis of bursitis when it actually could be a tendon-related issue and not a bursa issue at all. So make sure you can kind of differentiate between those 2. Secondly, is this idea of groin pain, okay? Groin issues we see a lot of when it comes to, on the backswing or the downswing, in particular downswing because of speed. On the downswing, you get a lot of speed, and again, if you got some irritation to the front of your hip, it can sometimes cause that groin discomfort. What you need to make sure too, though, is you differentiate what's actual groin muscular versus like hip joint, okay? Because the hip joint itself, the ball and socket, can refer pain into your groin, which could be contributing to the discomfort you're experiencing, right? So if you've had, let's say, some pre-existing issues with the hip joint itself, that could be causing groin discomfort, and that's where it's coming from, versus just actual muscular tissue itself. The last thing you need to consider is whether or not the hip pain that you're actually experiencing is actually coming from golf, right? Or are you actually bringing the hip pain to the golf course and then the hip pain is being triggered by golf itself? Okay, maybe you're doing things that are repetitive in nature throughout the day that you really don't think much of, but then it's getting triggered when you actually are swinging the golf clubs or walking on the golf course. So you need to consider that as well. Maybe the pain that you're experiencing isn't actually from golf, it's actually from something else that you're doing on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis that could be contributing to your hip discomfort. And then lastly, is the hip pain that you're experiencing actually coming from your hip? Okay, we see a lot of people who have quote-unquote hip-related issues that are actually coming from your back, right? So when we, again, going back to this idea of slide and sway, when we slide, we get a lot of lateral compression through the lumbar spine or the low back. And when that happens, that can sometimes irritate some of the nerves in the low back to innervate some of the muscles in the hip and can refer pain into the hip itself. So again, we need to make sure that we're finding what the root source of the issue is versus just treating symptoms. If we treat symptoms, it may go away. If we treat the source of the issue, good chance it goes away altogether. All right, in summary, 2 main causes of the hip discomfort are usually poor mechanics in your golf swing, a lot of lateral sway and slide on the backswing and downswing. And then secondly, a lot of repetitive overuse, okay? If those muscles aren't able to handle the stress that you're applying to it, then they get overworked, and sometimes that's what causes irritation. The 3 main types of hip discomfort: hip bursitis or glute tendon issues, okay? Groin pain, or is it actually hip joint pain? Or actually, the last thing is not even your hip at all. It's actually just your low back, right? So you need to make sure those are the main 3 things that we see a lot of golfers struggle with, and we need to kind of figure out how to differentiate what's what and find the root source of the issue. All right, so here's some next steps for you. Number 1, find a provider. Find someone who's well-versed in golf and understand hip pain so that they can figure out what the root source of the issue is to get your pain under control. Number 2, develop a plan and execute on it. If you've been dealing with this for an extended amount of time, you need to find someone who can help. If you don't feel comfortable going to a local provider, reach out to us and we can figure out what those next steps look for you. And then lastly, make sure you understand what's going on, okay? If you truly understand what's going on, it's going to better help you figure out how best to move forward. Don't try and piecemeal it, okay? Find a provider, execute your plan, and then play without limitations. All right, thanks so much for tuning into this week's episode of the Minute Golf Performance Podcast. If you're someone who's dealing with hip pain or just pain in general, leave a comment below so we can figure out what those next steps look like for you. Subscribe to our channel to make sure you don't miss any of the content we're putting out, and make sure that you check out this playlist of all the movements that we give all our golfers before they start swinging. We'll check you on the next video.